in the portion of Bahar, the Torah speaks about the sabbatical year, which is referred to as Shmita. The Torah tells us 6 years you're permitted to engage agriculturally in your property, in your land, plant it, harvest it, whatever you want to do. The 7th year comes, the land must remain fallow. So we have cycle 6, 7. 6 years you work the field. The 7th year it must remain fallow. You're not permitted to work the field. Why? So the Torah tells us it's Shabbos Lashem. You must designate it as Shabbos, means to refrain from this kind of activity and should be dedicated for God. So Rashi in his commentary cites the Midrash, just as we find the Shabbos, which we keep every 7 days, is to commemorate God as the creator of existence within the context of the land of Israel. 6 years, you're involved in the mundane. The 7th year, you must remove yourself, dedicate the year for God. What does that mean? So if you look in some of the commentators, they explain for serving God, meditation, reflection, and the study of Torah. You dedicate the year for your spirituality. That's what you do. I mentioned the name of Rameir Simcha of Dvinsk, that we find there's a stark difference between Shabbos and Yom Tif and the festivals and the holidays. Shabbos, the 7th day of the week, not only are creative activities were not food related, not permitted, even food related activities are not permitted. You're not permitted to cook, to bake, to transport from domain to domain. Yom Tif, the festivals, you're permitted. Cooking, baking, even something you could have done from before the holiday, there's a mitzvah to have the freshest food, most recently cooked item. Transport from public domain to private domain as much as you want. So Rameir Simcha of Dvinsk explains that when we experience the Shabbos, what are we doing? What does God want? We should focus on our relationship with Him. Focus on the relationship with Him means no distraction. The focus is your value of existence. Why do you exist? You exist for His glory. He's the creator. And not to be distracted with social relationships. It's not a social day. Yom Tif, on the other hand, is Bein Odom L'Chaveiro. We know that the Torah is divided into 2 parts. You have Bein Odom L'Amokom, we have the service between man and God, and we have also, which is also coupled with God, it's God's commandment, but there's Bein Odom L'Chaveiro, to perfect our relationships with our fellow brothers. And that's what Yom Tif is all about. You cook, you bake, you bring food to others, they come to you, you carry. Anything which relates to the holiday within certain limitations is permitted. And it's a mitzvah. You fulfill the mitzvah of what? Of rejoicing and celebrating the holiday of Yom Tif. The restrictions are not applicable because that's Bein Odom L'Chaveiro. Shabbos is Bein Odom L'Amokom. Focus on your relationship with God. And if you're involved with distractions, this detracts from the level of clarity. Shmita is exactly what Shabbos is. Shabbos Lashem. You designate the 7th day for this level of focus. The 7th year, the sabbatical year, you remove yourself from the mundane. And what? And you focus on what? On your relation with God. The objective of life, and to internalize that objective. And that you need a year removed from the mundane to focus on this. That's what it's about. The Torah tells us that if you work the field for 6 years, the 7th year, all the produce is ownerless. As the Torah says, you're not permitted even to protect it from others entering into your property. You have to leave it available for anybody who wants to come in. But what's going to happen? 7th year, you don't have the harvest because the owner can't bring it in for himself. You're not permitted to plant the field, to till the field, plowing. None of that's permitted. So what's going to be in the 8th? So the first time you're able to plant is in the 8th year. You're not going to have actually a return on your investment until the end of the 8th year. So what's going to be? How are you going to be covered for the next upcoming years? God says, no problem. There are one of two solutions. Either it says, Vochalto l'sova, that you'll eat the less, but the less will sate you as if it's more, which is miraculous. The Mishnah tells us in one location that during the Second Temple period, there were over 300 high priests. Could you imagine? During the First Temple period, which existed 410 years, there's a question where there are 12 or there are 18, spanning the 410-year period. The second Bayis Sheni, the Second Temple period, over 300. What happened? Why do you need so many high priests? So the Midrash tells us that the people who officiated, they weren't qualified, even though they were Kohanim. They would go into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and they would put a rope around their waist, and they'd have to pull them out every year because they would expire, because they weren't worthy to stand in the presence of God. That was the intensity of God's presence. So they would die. That means we weren't doing very well during the Second Temple period. Now, and among those years, there was a very devout high priest. His name was Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the Pious. His reign of high priest was for 40 years. Every Shabbos, we had a golden table in the covered sanctuary, which contained the showbread. There were 12 loaves of showbread, 2 stacks, 6 and 6. The Kohanim who officiated, it wasn't the same Kohanim who officiated all year round. There was a rotation system. Every family, the families had a 24-week rotation system. So every Shabbos, the new family would come in, and the family that officiated for the whole week would go out. They'd be finished. You had showbread. They would take the showbread off the golden table, and they would divide it between the incoming family and the outcoming family. And they would put on new showbread on the table until the following week, to be divided again the following week. Could you imagine? Between the incoming, outcoming, you could have over 1,000 Kohanim, minimally. And you have to divide 12 loaves of bread. How do you divide it? I mean, each person gets less than a crumb. So how do you divide it? So the Mishnah tells us that as long as Shimon HaTzadik was alive, a blessing went into the bread. And if a Kohen would receive as much as a piece of bread that was larger than a small bean, he would eat it and he'd be sated. Couldn't eat more than a bean. That was the volume of the bread. But how could a bean size sate a person? The answer was a miracle. Ochel ma'at u'misbarach v'meyav. You'd eat a minuscule amount and it was blessed in your innards. It nourished the person, it satisfied the person. We find the man in the midbar, the manna. People would go out and they bring in for their families. It says, the one who gathered more always had exactly the right amount. The one who gathered less, he always had the exact amount. It was miraculous. How did it work? And this wafer-like food sated the person satisfied. It was a miracle. God says, if you observe my sabbatical year, and you will not, in the 6th year, you will have a normal volume, a normal yield, but that yield will be the equivalent of 3 yields. Why? Because the smaller amount will be the equivalent of more. Ochel kimam is baruch b'mei. If you eat a minuscule, it will sate you. Well, what happens? It says, if you will ask a question, man nochal, if you ask the question, said, well, what are we going to eat? Factually, it's only the yield of 1 year. So the Torah says, "V'tzivisis berchosi," I will command my blessing, and in the 6th year, you're going to have a 3-year yield. You're going to have a bumper crop. So before your eyes, visually, you'll see you have a volume of 3 years worth of yield. That'll cover you for the 3 years. That you'll be able to be covered until you'll be able to harvest the planting of the 8th year. So the Sephardo asks, what's going on? First, the Torah says, "Vochalta l'sova." You will eat the yield of the 6th year and you'll be sated. Then it says, all of a sudden, God is giving you a 3-year yield in advance to cover you for 3 years. So he explains, if a person has faith in God, and God says the less is the equivalent of the more, you merit the miracle. But if a person says, seeing is believing, how could less be more? So God said, if you're not at that level, the tzivisis berchosi, then I have to command my blessing that you'll have before your eyes, you will see you'll have a 3-year yield. So you cover it for 3 years. So it depends at what level you are. You're at that special level, the less is the equivalent of more. You're not at that special level, I will have to give you a 3-year yield in the 6th year. As long as Shimon HaTzadik was alive, in his merit and his influence, the generation was still special. Therefore, the bread had blessing in it. Therefore, if you would eat a minuscule amount of bread, is no larger than the volume of a pea, of a small bean, you were saved. What happened after he passed away? The Mishnah tells us, "Nichnasa me'ero b'lechem haponim." A curse went into the showbread, and it said, so how do you have 12 loaves of bread, which is sufficient for thousands of Kohanim? The incoming group, the outcoming group, impossible. So the Gemara says, the modest people, they withdrew from it. The gluttons, they fought over it. They fought over it to get whatever they could get. But the modest Kohanim, the modest ones, they drew their hands. What happened? It's the same showbread. No. If Shimon HaTzadik is the high priest who officiates 40 years, you merit the special blessing. The less is the more. You don't, then the whatever it is, that's what it is. That's its limitation. If that's the case, if you want to get a peace, you have to fight for your peace. The modest Kohanim, they withdrew. It wasn't worthwhile. The gluttons, they fought over it. Now, we say, Ezo Asher Samech V'Chelko. Who is the wealthy man? The one who's satisfied with his lot. You could ask a question. A person is a surgeon, a neurosurgeon. He earns hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. A person is a kollel person. He studies. After he's married, postgraduate, he's barely making ends meet. But somehow he makes it. His tuitions, his food, he makes it. The surgeon who has the 6-car garage with the hundreds of thousands of dollars in income, and he has to take special insurance in case he gets sued, which may be at least a year's worth of his salary. At the end of the day, he has enough. But if we say, if we say one's yearly stipend is determined for Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, why does God set the stipend of the surgeon or the lawyer or the this or the that at a higher amount than the person who's the tzaddik or the Talmud Chacham? Why? You know why? The answer is, why is a person, the Asher Samech V'Chelko, why is he Samech V'Chelko? Either it's enough or not enough. The answer is somehow you're able to get less by on less. And people don't know, how do you get by on less? Somehow it works out. And God allows you to somehow balance the books, you get away with less. The other person, God says, you know something? If it's kochim yotzim yodi, if it's you, you're your own maker of success, you know something? Then you're on your own. Then you need mega doses of material to satisfy what you need. That's why that's a samech chelko. The person samech v'chelko, God, he merits that special blessing that the less is the equivalent of the more. He doesn't need more. I don't need more. The person who's not at that level, the less is not the more. Therefore, he needs the more. That's the difference between two. Therefore, God sets the amount which is pre-designated for the other person at a higher number than the person who's at that more spiritually connected at the lesser number, for that reason. This is a story where Rav Shach, he was a person, he was a Kolo person in Bnei Brak, and he was earning a certain amount of money, and he was just making ends meet. And he wanted to provide a little bit more for his family. So what did he do? He took off a few hours of his sleep, and he went to work in a bakery. And although he was semi-sleep deprived, but he felt he wants to provide for his family, they should have a little bit more. But after he worked and made that extra income, somehow he was only able to make ends meet. Nothing changed. So he went to Rav Shach and he asked Rav Shach, what's going on? Here, before I went to work, I was making ends meet. Now I'm making this extra income. Again, I'm making ends meet. And I'm not able to provide more than I provided before. So Rav Shach says, you know something? Sleep more, study as you studied before, and you'll make the same ends meet. Because the fact is, whatever you're meant to have, you're going to have. And you have to have that level of faith. And if you have it, the less is the more. But if you feel you have to make that extra income and take that extra job, which compromises you to a degree, if that's the case, is the more you make, the more you'll need. You're not going to merit to be able to make ends meet. And therefore, my advice to you is give up the job, that night job, sleep those hours, and you should be more fresh, be fully involved in what you're doing. But that's the understanding. So if you have the faith, you will eat your bread to be sated. The less is the more. But if not, you'll ask the question, Manocha, what do we need? You'll have 3 years in advance, you'll have the bumper crop, which will cover you volume-wise, you'll have sufficient. That's the simple understanding of the sabbatical year. Okay? We read in the Midrash that after the destruction of the first temple, Beis Hamikdash, we spent 70 years in exile in Babylon. It was 70 years. Why 70 years? The reason why it was destroyed was because they violated 3 cardinal sins. And they didn't study Torah with the right intent. Because otherwise they wouldn't spiritualize, they wouldn't have fallen to that level. But why 70 years? So the Midrash tells us, based on verses and prophets, that the Jews themselves, when they were in Israel, during the first temple period, from the time they entered, they did not observe 70 sabbatical years. And because they violated 70 sabbatical years, to every year they didn't observe the sabbatical time, they didn't observe it correctly, they kept out a year. What does that mean? For instance, it's a law that if you live in Israel and you have your property and you want to sell your property, which was given to your family when the land was originally divided among the families, you want to sell it for more than 49 years. The 50th year is the Jubilee year. During the Jubilee, everything returns to its original ownership. If a person says, you know something, I'm willing to sell my property for 60 years. It's not a valid sale. In Israel, it's not a valid sale. Why is it not a valid sale? Because God says, Kili kol ha'oretz. God says, I am the landlord. You people are only tenant farmers. You have tenant farmer rights that 6 years you work the land as if it's yours. The 7th year, the condition is you have to make the produce and the field available for whoever wants to go in there. And if you compromise it, that's violation of the tenant-landlord agreement. So how many times do we violate that agreement? 70 times. So every time, God is giving you it gratis, the 6 years. On the condition you leave the 7th year. But if you violate the tenant-landlord agreement, contract, every year you violated, you're out of the land for a year. So because we violated it for 70 years, therefore we were in exile for 70 years for that reason. That's where the number 70 comes from. So that's a very simple question. If you're at that special level, the 6th year could be an ordinary yield, but the less is the equivalent of more. Ochel kimum's birch b'meyav. But if you're not at that special level, God gives you 3 years in advance in the bank. So if God gives you 3 years in advance in the bank, why did they keep the seventh year? You'd say, because I can't have people take what I created, because that's money, that's my profit. But God pays for the crop and gives you 3 years in advance to cover you till you're able to harvest the 8th year's crop. Why are you violating it? You could have the cake and eat it, as they say. You could observe the sabbatical year and you have the financial payment for it, whatever the value is. Why not? Why is it so terrible? What was the difficulty? Why couldn't they keep it? So you'd say maybe they were too greedy. The greed was so overwhelming. We could take the 3 years and we even want more. To say there were that many Jews who were greedy to that degree, or maybe it's even less than that. And that's why they did not observe the Shmita and they did not keep it for that reason. Okay? Now, there's a verse in Tehillim where David HaMelech says, Baruch Hashem Alochav, the angels bless God. And who are the angels? Giborei Koach. They have enormous strength, angels. Osei Dvaro Lishma B'Kol Dvaro. They do his word and they listened to his voice, to what that dictate is. So the order of the pasuk of the verse is, the angels are Giborei Koach. They're tremendously great in strength. They carry out his word even before they hear his command. They're ready to go to do his will, even before they're aware of the extent of his will. They are the Giborei Koach, who he's speaking about. So the first interpretation of the Midrash is Moshe and Aaron. Moshe and Aaron, they were Giborei Koach. And it cites a verse. Second interpretation of the Giborei Koach, they have the strength of angels, powerful, that they accept the word of God before knowing the extent. The Jews at Sinai. When we offered the Torah, we said Nasav Nishma. Although we didn't know the extent of the obligation, we didn't ask, as the other nations asked, what's it all about? We embraced it. It's your will, we accept. Just tell us what to do. Therefore, the Jews at Sinai are Giborei Koach Osed Dvaro. They're the equivalent of angels. They spoke the language of angels. The third interpretation is, who are the Giborei Koach? The people, the Jews who observe the Shmita, the sabbatical year. The ones who observe the sabbatical year, they have tremendous willpower, strength. Why? So let's read the Midrash. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha Omer, Elu Shomri Shviyas. These are the ones who observe the Shviyas, the Shmita, the sabbatical year. V'loma nikra shmom Giborei Koach. Why are they referred to as the people? They have enormous strength. Roas shesadeo mufkeris. Person goes, capital investment, sweat and blood, toil from dawn to dusk, and all of a sudden the 7th year comes. It's ownerless. It's treated like there's no proprietor. Vilonosa mufkarim. The crop becomes ownerless. It's treated as if it's ownerless. The orchards, the vineyards, it's like they have no owner. It's a free-for-all. Vasiyog mifurotzim. Person has fences around his property to protect it. The fences are breached. They come down. Verola peirosa of necholim. He sees all these people. They're devouring his produce. It's like the locust attacked. It's the year of the locust. The kovish is yitzro. And here he's watching this. This is his sweat and blood, his financial investment. He has no say in the matter. And he remains silent. He has no right to protest because God says it's all ownerless. V'shanu rabbanon, Rabbi Seinu, Izel Gibor, Kovish Yitzro. Read in Pirkei Avos. Who is the strong person? The one who suppresses his inclination. As a result of that, they are the true Giborei Koach. The observers of the sabbatical year are Giborei Koach. To be able to restrain yourself, to watch this happening, and not to say a word, as they used to say, you have to be made out of iron. This is something you can burst a blood vessel and you see this happening. Everything going up in smoke before your eyes and not having a say in the matter. So what exactly is the problem? But you're reimbursed. God gave you 3-year yield in advance to cover it. But you know what the problem is? It's my field, it's my produce. I created it. And it's just ownerless. It's being plundered. It's being taken as if there's no owner. I have no say in the matter. And I have to remain silent. For that, you need willpower. That there's nothing comparable to that level of the willpower. You have to be an angel. So what was the challenge of the Shomrei Shvius, of the observers of the Shmita? It wasn't a financial issue. Factually, I created that produce. Factually, the land is mine. The fences were put up by me to protect my asset. And now it's like I'm invisible. It means nothing what I think, what I say, and they take all they want. And I can't stop it. To be able to watch that, your creation to go up in smoke, you have to be an angel. Otherwise, anything less than that, you couldn't control yourself. So why did the Jews violate 70 sabbaticals? It's not a financial issue. Now, what drives a person? His ego. There's the me, it's the I. So I always say something interesting. We find in the portion of Kedoshim, we read about the mitzvah of Peyo, that if a Jew has a field in Israel and you harvest your crop, you have to leave the corner of the field to the poor. If you have a vineyard, you have to leave the grapes that are left on the tree for the poor. A certain amount has to be left. It's called Peyo. Peyo means the edge of the field has to be left. So the Midrash quotes a verse that says, at the end of time, the only people who are going to remain in existence are the Jewish people. Why? Because just as they leave the remnant of the field for the poor to take, they will be the remnant of humanity, the Jewish people. But the nations of the world who don't leave the corner of their fields, which is the remnant of the harvest, there will not be a representation of them. They will all go into the oblivion. All the nations of the world, there'll be individuals, but the nations, they're going into the oblivion. Because just as they don't leave the corner of the field, there's no remnant, there will not be a remnant of theirs. What exactly is it saying? Because you leave the remnant, therefore you will be a remnant at the end of time, but the nations of the world not. What's it all about? So the way I understand it is this way. The law is in Israel, the produce, whether it's grain, whether it's fruit, before you partake of that grain or that produce, you have to tithe it. You're not permitted to eat it until you tithe it. You give a certain percentage to the Kohen. You take 10%, you give it to the Levi. You take another 10%, you give it to the poor. And these are called tithes, and you're obligated. And you take, the times you take 10%, you have to eat it in Yerushalayim. You're restricted. It has a restricted area in which you can eat it. Okay? I tithe the tithe that's given to the Kohen. A Kohen comes to me and says, I would like the tithe that's called Truma, which is designated for the Kohen. I want you to give it to me. The one who has that has no obligation to give it to that Kohen. The one who has that tithe, he has a right to choose whichever Kohen he chooses. The Kohen cannot demand to take possession. He has no right. The right of choice of which Kohen you choose, that's up to the one who actually owned that grain, owned that produce. The 10% he gives to the Levi. No Levi could come and demand, I want that 10%, because that's my tithe. The Torah gives him the right to choose which Levi he wants to give it to, which poor man you want to give it to. No poor man could say, I'm the one you must give it to. Now, what is the main value of ownership if it's not a financial issue? It's proprietary. It's demonstrating I am the owner. It's mine. If it's mine, I have a right to say who, what, and where. So if we give you the rights, although you have to give away that percentage to the Kohen, but God says, but it's up to you to give whichever Kohen you choose. So there's a goodwill aspect to it. There's a reciprocation aspect. There's a beholding for the person who receives it because you chose him. So because the person has a gain as a human being and he has a say when yes and when not, therefore I feel that's demonstrating ownership. However, when we speak about the sabbatical year, you have no say in the matter. There's no goodwill. When the seventh year comes, as it says, the fences come down, all your grain, all your produce becomes ownerless. Foe, friend, anybody who wants to come in, he has a right to take without a thank you. And it's equivalent, they plunder it. And you have no say in the matter. And you have to watch this before your eyes. To be able to see something that you created to be taken without any acknowledgement, any recognition, this is so antithetical to the essence of what a human being is. You have to be an angel to be able to remain silent. You have to be gibor koach. You have to have that tremendous, enormous strength. When you harvest the field in Israel, not throughout the years, you must leave the corner of the field for the poor. That remnant, the cornfield has to be left for the poor. Now, the poor come to, the only one who's eligible to take that corner, or in the orchard, the fruit that's left on the tree, or the vineyard, you have to be financially poor. But if you are poor, you cannot dictate which poor man, yes, which poor man not. It's available to any poor man. So again, the aspect of not being able to say who, what, and when, as we apply to the sabbatical year, applies to the gleanings that are left in the field, or the corner of the field that's left there. You have no say in the matter. So the challenge of the owner of the field that we have by Shmita, by the sabbatical year, but of course it's a greater challenge, is similar. There's no goodwill because it's not for you to choose who should and who should not. Now, to be able to observe this properly, what do you need? You need a total negation to the will of God. It's your will, God, it's your will. That's all I have to hear. I'm irrelevant. I'm not part of the equation. The non-Jew, unless there's a payback, there's a benefit, the non-Jew cannot do this. For instance, at Sinai, God offers the Torah to the nations of the world. What's the first question they asked? They asked, what is it all about? What's written in it? God says, thou shalt not commit murder. That's what God says to the Edomites. They say, you know something? It's not for us, because we have a blessing from our forefather. We live by the sword. But if God's offering, why even ask the question? The answer is, unless they see it conforms to their values and lifestyle, they can't accept it. That level of negation to God doesn't exist by the nations of the world. And that's why every nation that was offered the opportunity to take the Torah, they rejected it because it did not conform with their understanding of what life's all about. What did the Jews say? The Jews didn't even ask what's it all about. They just says, we accept unequivocally. If it's your will, we want it. What is it about? What's the extent? Doesn't make a difference. That can only be expressed if you totally negate it to God. And that's similar to the angel. The value of the angel is only to do the will of God. Just give us the order, we're ready to do it, to carry it out immediately. Therefore, that's what the Medrash says. The Jews will leave the corner of their fields at the end of time, as you left a remnant of the field for the poor, although you had no benefit, because you have no say in the matter, at the end of time, what's the end of time? The end of time is totally basking in God's glory, in the radiance of God. To be worthy of that, you can't have that barrier. You can't have that distance. You can't have that separation. So the non-Jew can't. Excuse me. They have no relevance to the future. But the Jews who can negate themselves were negated to God. Therefore, we have the capacity to become part of God's equation for that reason. You find something simpler. We find that after the splitting of the sea, we were attacked by Amalek, by the Amalekites. And God says, because they were able to attack you after the world stood in awe of the Jewish people because of what God did on their behalf, destroying the mightiest Egyptian armies and the sea closing on them, and they could attack you. My throne is not complete till they're obliterated from under the heavens. That's Amalek. So we fast forward to the 40th year in the desert. Bilam being the prophet of the nations, and he begins prophesying, and he makes a statement. Reishis goyim Amalek, achrisu adi oved. The Amalekites were the first nation to attack the Jewish people. Therefore, at the end of time, they will not exist. What does this mean? Because we were the first to attack the Jewish people. Therefore, at the end of time, when God will expunge evil from the world, Amalek will not exist whatsoever. There will not be a trace of them. So Rav Hutner, Zeichat Tzaddik Livrocha, Rashiva Chaim Berlin explained it this way. We find that Shlomo Melech in Mishlei and Proverbs refers to, he says, there's a person that's called a letz. A letz is a deprecator. How do you deal with a deprecator? A scoffer. So he says, let's takeh. The only way you can deal with a deprecator, you have to smite him. Pesi Yarim, a person who's a hedonist, he's into the material, he can be wizened. If you show him the correct way, he can be wizened. What is this all about? What's a deprecator? A deprecator is a person, even something of special value, he deprecates. Something which is obvious, he deprecates. He scoffs at. But if you recognize that it's special, how do you deprecate it? The answer is the person doesn't have the capacity to appreciate the value. And because he doesn't have to appreciate, that's why he deprecates. I'll give you an example. A person is a comedian and he has a father and he truly reveres his father and he loves his father. And there's nothing he will not do. And he's always out to protect the honor of his father. And when he's hired to be the comedian, said, we want you to make an impersonation of your father. And because we want the crowd to really laugh. That comedian, as good as he is, he's not going to impersonate his father. Because impersonating his father automatically means that you don't value your father for who he is. Therefore, using him as the subject for comedy, that's the ultimate deprecation. That says clearly you don't appreciate who he is. If the Amalekites could attack us after God performed miracles which cannot be denied as the hand of God, how do you attack the Jewish people? With the such obviousness of God, there's only one answer. You don't have the capacity at any level to appreciate spirituality. You don't have not even an infinitesimal degree of capacity. So what is the world to come? What's at the end of existence? What is it all about? Having a relation with God. But since the Amalekites don't have any capacity to have that, and proof of the pudding is that they attacked us after the splitting of the sea, therefore Bilam says, Reishis goyim Amalek, because you were the first nation to attack the Jews after the splitting of the sea and the closing of the sea. Achrisu adi oved. At the end of time, which is to have a relation with God, you can't be there because you don't have a capacity to have any appreciation of what spirituality is. Therefore, at the end of time, you're going into the oblivion for that reason. The Jews at Sinai, we had a capacity which is not comparable to anyone else. Anyone else cannot compare to us. It was a level of negation as the angel. I'm here to do your will. But what's the extent of your will? Doesn't make a difference. Whatever it is, if it's your will, I'm here to abide by it and to live by that. Therefore, the Jews at Sinai were called Gibori Koach. They're like angels who have tremendous power. Also, Dvaro, they do his word even before they hear what it's about. And that's exactly that characteristic manifests itself in the observers of the Shmita. Although they have no say in the matter, but if that's the will of God, we negate ourselves. And it's not only we turn a blind eye, but if we know what's happening, how do you contain yourself? How do you control it? The answer is you suppress that. It's the ultimate level of willpower, but the willpower is rooted in the will of God. Therefore, the Shomrei Shviyos are the Gebara Koach, which are the equivalent of angels for that reason. And therefore, we leave the payer, we leave the remnant of the field, because we're able to do that. Although there's no payback, there's no benefit on a personal level, no goodwill. Therefore, at the end of time, that only indicates what level of negation you have. The nations who don't have that capacity, they will not be there. Because minimally, you have to have that level of capacity to be able to appreciate who God is. And therefore, since you can't, therefore, there's no place. It doesn't mean that there aren't going to be Gentiles, but we're talking about the nations of the world as a whole will not be there for that reason. I think we'll stop here this week.